By the winter of 1915, the Western Front had frozen into stalemate. From the North Sea to the Swiss border, millions of men faced one another across a devastated strip of land that neither side could cross without enormous loss. Trench systems, barbed wire, and machine guns had replaced movement with attrition. Amid this deadlock, the German High Command sought a way to break the equilibrium, not through sweeping advances, but through destruction. They would strike at a point so vital to France's pride that the French army would be compelled to defend it to the last man, bleeding itself dry in the process. That place was Verdun. Verdun was more than a fortress. It was a symbol. Situated on the Meuse River in northeastern France, it had stood as a bulwark against German invasion for centuries. It was one of the keys to France's national defense system, heavily fortified after the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. To lose Verdun would not merely endanger the front, it would strike at the heart of the French spirit. The German Chief of Staff, General Erich von Falkenhayn, understood this psychological dimension. He believed that France's morale, rather than its armies, was the true target. If Verdun fell, or even if its defense demanded catastrophic sacrifices, France might sue for peace. Falkenhayn's infamous phrase captured his intent. He would bleed France white. Preparations began in secret. The German plan called for a massive artillery bombardment followed by a limited infantry advance to capture key forts around Verdun, particularly Fort Douaumont and Fort Vaux. The objective was not to seize large territory, but to provoke the French into counterattacking again and again into a carefully prepared killing zone. The Germans assembled over 1,000 heavy guns, including the monstrous 420mm Big Bertha howitzers, capable of obliterating fortifications. Thousands of tons of shells were stockpiled along narrow forest roads, and railways were extended to feed the coming onslaught. The plan's elegance lay in its brutality. It sought not victory through maneuver, but annihilation through endurance. The French, for their part, had not anticipated Verdun as a major target. The region was quiet compared to the bloodier fronts of Champagne and Artois. Many of Verdun's forts had been stripped of their guns earlier in the war to reinforce other sectors. French command considered them obsolete in the age of heavy artillery. When intelligence reports hinted at a German buildup, warnings were dismissed or delayed. By the time the offensive began, Verdun's defenses were dangerously thin. On the morning of February 21, 1916, the German bombardment began. For 9 hours, the earth shook beneath an artillery storm unlike anything yet seen. Over 2 million shells fell on a front less than 10 miles wide, transforming forests into splintered wastelands and villages into dust. Men huddled in trenches or deep dugouts, deafened and dazed as the ground quivered like a living thing. The air filled with smoke, dust, and the stench of explosives. Survivors later said that time itself seemed to dissolve. There was only noise, fire, and waiting for death. When the shelling lifted, waves of German infantry advanced through the shattered landscape, their gray uniforms blending with the fog. The French defenders fought desperately but were overwhelmed. Outposts were obliterated, communication lines severed. Entire units vanished in the bombardment. Within days, the Germans captured the outer defenses north of Verdun and pushed toward the forts that ringed the city. The scale of the attack shocked the French command. General Joseph Joffre, the army's chief, rushed reinforcements to the sector and appointed a new commander to lead the defense. General Philippe Pétain, a methodical, calm officer known for his mastery of artillery tactics and concern for his men. Pétain's arrival marked the beginning of Verdun's transformation from disaster into defiance. Recognizing that the city's survival depended on maintaining supply lines, he reorganized logistics around a single lifeline: the narrow road from Bar-le-Duc to Verdun, soon christened La Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Way. Day and night, convoys of trucks rumbled along it, delivering ammunition, food, and fresh troops, while carrying the wounded and dead back in the other direction. Every few seconds, another vehicle passed. Drivers were ordered never to stop, no matter what. This constant flow of men and material sustained Verdun under the heaviest fire of the war. To the soldiers, it became a symbol of endurance itself, a river of steel and courage. The Germans struck again on February 25th, capturing Fort Douaumont almost without a fight. The loss was devastating to French morale. Douaumont, the largest and most powerful fort in the region, had been considered impregnable. Its fall seemed to confirm Falkenhayn's prediction that France could not withstand such pressure. Yet instead of collapsing, France hardened its resolve. Pétain issued his famous order of the day: "Courage! On les aura! Courage! We shall get them!" Across the nation, Verdun became more than a battle. It became a sacred cause. Newspapers declared that the fate of France was being decided there. The cry, "They shall not pass," echoed from the trenches to the home front. March brought unrelenting violence. The Germans, now entrenched in Douaumont, advanced toward the next objective, Fort Vaux and the ridgelines overlooking the Meuse. Their artillery pounded French positions continuously, filling the air with choking clouds of smoke and dust. The French guns responded in kind. The battlefield became a furnace of steel where men lived underground for weeks, emerging only to fight or to die. Mud mixed with blood until it was impossible to tell one from the other. Corpses filled shell holes. Supplies had to be dragged by hand through the mire. The sound of artillery was so constant that soldiers reported hearing it even in their dreams. Despite the horror, the French defense stiffened. Pétain's system of troop rotation, moving divisions in and out of the line regularly, kept morale from collapsing. Nearly 70% of the French army would eventually serve at Verdun in some capacity, giving the entire nation a shared stake in its defense. Each man who passed through the inferno carried its memory home, binding France in a collective experience of suffering and endurance. Verdun became not just a battle, but a test of national will. As spring approached, the struggle intensified. The Germans expanded their assault to the west bank of the Meuse, seeking to capture the heights of Morhomme, Dead Man's Hill, and Côte 304, from which they could dominate the French lines. These names would soon become synonymous with slaughter. Both sides poured men and shells into the fight, achieving little but mutual devastation. The French clung to every inch of ground. The Germans, under pressure from their own leaders, could not withdraw. Verdun was consuming them both. By April, The front had become a living hell. Rain turned the trenches into lakes of filth. Shellfire unearthed the dead and scattered their remains across the fields. Soldiers spoke of Verdun as a place outside time, where the laws of nature no longer applied. Some went mad from exhaustion and fear. Others became numb, moving like automatons through the endless cycle of bombardment, attack, and counterattack. "Hell cannot be so terrible," wrote one French officer. "Men are mad enough to prefer it." And still, the guns roared. The battle that Falkenhayn had designed to drain France of its blood was now draining Germany as well. Neither side could stop. Verdun had become an altar on which two nations sacrificed their youth. By May 1916, Verdun had become a furnace from which no one emerged unchanged. The initial shock of the German assault had given way to a grinding struggle, in which every foot of earth was contested, bombarded, lost, and retaken again. The landscape that had once been forests and meadows was now a blasted desert of shell holes, splintered trees, and pulverized stone. Smoke hung permanently over the valley of the Meuse. Men lived underground like moles, fighting not only the enemy, but mud, hunger, and the creeping sense that the world beyond the battlefield no longer existed. After capturing Fort Douaumont in February, the Germans pressed on toward Fort Vaux, another stronghold dominating the eastern sector. The fight for Vaux became a microcosm of the entire battle, a struggle fought in darkness, suffocation, and unimaginable courage. Inside the fort, Commandant Sylvain Raynal and his garrison of 600 men endured weeks of continuous bombardment. German artillery rained shells of every caliber upon the structure until its walls trembled and its air became thick with dust and poison fumes. Water ran out. The defenders licked condensation from the walls to survive. They fought room by room, repelling flamethrower attacks and sealing breaches with their own bodies. When at last they surrendered on June 7th, after every cartridge and drop of water was gone, even their enemies saluted them. The defense of Vaux became legend, proof that French determination could not be extinguished by fire or steel. Outside the forts, the battle unfolded on a scale that defied comprehension. Verdun's artillery density was unmatched in history. At certain moments, more than 2,000 guns thundered at once, turning whole hills into clouds of dust. Observers described the Meuse hills as living volcanoes, erupting ceaselessly. Trees disappeared. Rivers changed course. Villages like Fleury and Douaumont were wiped from the map so completely that only their names remain today on memorial markers. Soldiers who fought in these sectors said the ground seemed alive, heaving under the bombardment, swallowing men whole. General Pétain's command brought a semblance of order to chaos. His insistence on methodical defense, anchored on artillery coordination and constant troop rotation, proved decisive in preventing collapse. Units were withdrawn after only a few days on the line, replaced by fresh divisions traveling up the Voie Sacrée, the sacred road that pulsed day and night with trucks and wagons. Mechanics stood at intervals along the route to keep traffic moving. A stopped vehicle could block the entire artery. In this way, Verdun was fed continuously. Men and munitions in one direction, the wounded and the dead in the other. It was a grim but efficient rhythm that kept France alive. Even with rotation, the soldiers' endurance was pushed beyond limits. The trenches offered little shelter from shell fire or rain. Rats thrived in the corpse-strewn mud, growing so large that men joked darkly about sharing rations with them. Sleep was rare and shallow. Food arrived cold and soaked in mud. Letters from the front described nightmares that persisted even when awake. Many soldiers believed Verdun was not just a place, but a punishment, a purgatory that would never end. Yet amid the horror, camaraderie flourished. Men shared jokes, songs, and the last of their wine. They wrote home not of despair, but of stubborn pride. Ils ne passeront pas. They shall not pass. In June, the Germans renewed their offensive with overwhelming force, launching gas attacks and waves of infantry assaults. Fort Vaux fell, but the French line held. Pétain's artillery exacted a terrible price from the attackers. German soldiers, too, lived in conditions scarcely imaginable. Dugouts flooded, rations spoiled, corpses decomposed where they fell. The constant roar of guns shattered nerves on both sides. Soldiers suffered tremors, stammering, and hallucinations, the early signs of what would later be called post-traumatic stress. Commanders rotated units, not just for tactical reasons, but to prevent mass breakdowns. The psychological battle extended far beyond the trenches. In Paris, Verdun had become a rallying cry. Posters, newspapers, and patriotic speeches transformed the defense into a national mission. Civilians sent letters and parcels to the front, while schoolchildren recited Pétain's slogans. For a country still haunted by defeat in 1870, Verdun was more than a fight for ground. It was a fight for dignity. The longer the army held, the stronger that conviction grew. Every hill, every shattered fort became a symbol of France itself, battered, bleeding, but unbroken. By midsummer, however, the strain on both armies was immense. The Germans had poured nearly 1 million men into the Verdun sector. Their commander, Crown Prince Wilhelm, increasingly doubted Falkenhayn's strategy. What had begun as an attempt to bleed France white was now bleeding Germany as well. Ammunition shortages, mounting casualties, and the need to divert forces to the new Allied offensive on the Somme forced adjustments. Still, the attacks continued, driven by momentum and by pride. Neither side could admit failure. In July, General Robert Nivelle replaced Pétain in operational command, allowing Pétain to coordinate the broader army group. Nivelle, more aggressive in temperament, prepared counterattacks to recapture the lost forts. His motto, "Vous ne les laisserez pas passer," "You will not let them pass," reflected confidence that offense, properly supported by artillery, could restore initiative. French guns now dominated the battlefield. By midsummer, they outnumbered the German batteries 2-1. The air was thick with cordite and dust. The sound of explosions rolled endlessly like thunder. At the front, soldiers noticed subtle changes. Supplies improved. Morale stiffened, and rumors spread that the enemy was weakening. Yet each new assault demanded fresh sacrifices. The recapture of the village of Fleury in August cost thousands of lives and yielded only rubble. Men advanced over ground so churned by shells that compasses failed. Trenches disappeared. Orientation itself became impossible. Verdun, one survivor said, was not a battle, but an earthquake. As August turned to September, exhaustion became universal. Hospitals behind the lines overflowed with the wounded. Medical staff worked amid chaos, their tents rattled by distant shell fire. For the men who returned to the line, hope narrowed to survival from one day to the next. Officers struggled to maintain discipline. Desertions and self-inflicted wounds rose, though far fewer than might be expected. Most endured, bound by duty and the unspoken understanding that no one could abandon his comrades. It was solidarity, more than patriotism, that kept Verdun from falling. By autumn, the strategic picture was shifting. The Somme offensive, launched in July, forced the Germans to divert artillery and reserves away from Verdun. The French seized the opportunity to strike back. Plans were drawn to retake the forts of Douaumont and Vaux, the very symbols whose loss had once seemed catastrophic. The counter-offensive would begin in October, supported by a hurricane of French artillery fire and aided by improved coordination between infantry and guns. Verdun's defenders, who had endured 7 months of unrelenting pressure, were now preparing to become attackers once more. The city itself remained under intermittent bombardment. Civilians who had not fled lived in caves or cellars, emerging only to fetch water. Churches were shattered. Hospitals struck repeatedly. Yet morale, astonishingly, held. Verdun's mayor refused evacuation, declaring that the city would share the fate of its garrison. In this resolve, the civilian population mirrored the soldiers at the front, a unity of endurance that gave the word Verdun a resonance beyond strategy. As October approached, rain returned to the Meuse Valley. The ground, already cratered, turned again to mud. The soldiers preparing for the counterattack did so amid familiar misery. Still, there was a sense of anticipation, even quiet satisfaction. They had survived the worst. Now it was their turn. The guns, once instruments of defense, would soon roar in vengeance. By the time autumn settled over the Meuse Valley in 1916, the soldiers of both armies had been fighting for nearly 9 months without reprieve. The ground was so churned by shells that even the landscape seemed exhausted. Craters filled with rainwater, trenches collapsed into the earth, and the stench of decay hung over everything. What had begun as a German attempt to bleed France into submission had become a mutual ordeal. The front had hardly moved, yet both nations had sacrificed hundreds of thousands of men. The battle now stood poised to enter its final, transformative phase. The French counterattack. The German command had long since realized that Verdun would not yield the decisive victory Falkenhayn had promised. The onset of the Allied offensive on the Somme had forced them to shift artillery and manpower northward, weakening their positions around Verdun. Morale among their troops was ebbing. Letters intercepted by French intelligence revealed despair and disbelief. "We are in hell," one German soldier wrote. "It cannot go on." The French, meanwhile, were recovering strength. Under the leadership of Generals Pétain and Nivelle, the army reorganized, reinforced, and prepared to reclaim the forts whose loss had once seemed catastrophic. For the first time since February, Verdun would see the French army go on the offensive. The plan for the October counterattack was bold and precise. Thousands of guns were assembled along the front, their positions meticulously plotted by reconnaissance aircraft. Artillery coordination had evolved dramatically since the battle's opening. Instead of the indiscriminate shelling that characterized earlier months, the French now used concentrated rolling barrages to suppress enemy defenses just ahead of the advancing infantry. Observation balloons floated in the gray sky, directing fire onto key positions. The soldiers who would attack were hardened veterans, men who had survived the inferno of Verdun's trenches and who now fought with grim determination rather than naive courage. On October 20th, the French guns opened fire. The bombardment lasted several days, shaking the ground for miles around. Survivors of the earlier phases of Verdun said it was the most intense shelling yet. An apocalyptic thunder meant to erase months of humiliation. When the barrage lifted on October 24th, French infantry surged forward through smoke and sleet. What followed was swift and astonishing. The Germans, depleted and demoralized, were unable to resist with their former strength. By nightfall, Fort Douaumont, the very symbol of France's ordeal, was back in French hands. The recapture of Douaumont electrified the nation. Newspapers hailed it as a miracle of courage and precision. For months, Douaumont had loomed in the French imagination as a scar, a reminder of loss and vulnerability. Its return transformed despair into pride. The victory was not merely strategic, it was psychological. France had proved that Verdun would not fall, that endurance could triumph where aggression had failed. Soldiers who had once fought only to survive now felt they were part of something larger, a redemption written in smoke and blood. The Germans, though still entrenched on the surrounding ridges, knew the tide had turned. Their artillery was outmatched, their troops worn down by fatigue and illness. Supply lines, strained by the demands of the Somme and the Eastern Front, could no longer sustain the same intensity. Falkenhayn, architect of the Verdun offensive, had been dismissed in August, replaced by Hindenburg and Ludendorff. The new commanders viewed Verdun as a drain rather than an opportunity. Their priority was now to conserve strength for future operations, yet even withdrawal proved costly. Every attempt to reinforce or resupply the front drew more French fire. Every effort to counterattack bled them further. As the French consolidated Douaumont, their attention turned to Fort Vaux. Though ruined and uninhabitable, it remained a symbolic objective. In early November, after another massive artillery preparation, French troops advanced again. The Germans, realizing their position was untenable, evacuated before the attack could begin. On November 2nd, French patrols entered the fort unopposed, finding only corpses and wreckage. The tricolor flag was raised above the shattered structure, fluttering weakly in the cold wind. The news spread quickly. Verdun's forts, once lost, were once again French. The recapture of Douaumont and Vaux did not end the fighting, but it broke the battle's momentum. From November onward, Verdun entered a new phase of grinding attrition, with the French gradually pushing the Germans back from the heights north of the city. Each hill and ravine, Thiaumont, Fleury, Douaumont Wood, was retaken inch by inch at terrible cost. The artillery never ceased. By now, the French guns fired more shells in a single week than they had in the entire war up to 1915. The roar was constant, a background to existence. Soldiers described it as the voice of Verdun, a sound that lived in their ears long after they left the front. Winter came early that year. Snow blanketed the wasteland, softening its jagged edges but deepening its misery. The frozen ground made digging impossible. Frostbite joined shellfire as a constant threat. Yet, paradoxically, the cold brought a kind of beauty. The white fields glowed eerily under the moonlight, illuminating the wreckage of guns and corpses alike. Some soldiers wrote home of the strange quiet between bombardments, when even death seemed to pause. But such moments were fleeting. At any hour, the guns might awaken again, shaking the snow from the twisted remains of trees. By December, Verdun was nearing its end. The French army had regained most of the ground lost since February, and the German command saw no further purpose in continuing the fight. On December 18th, the French launched their final major assault of the battle, capturing the last German positions on the left bank of the Meuse. The offensive ended not with a dramatic climax, but with exhaustion. The guns fell silent, tentatively, almost reluctantly, after 10 months of continuous fire. The longest battle of the Great War was over. The statistics were staggering. France had suffered approximately 377,000 casualties. Germany, around 337,000. Combined, nearly 750,000 men had been killed, wounded, or gone missing for a few square miles of shattered terrain. The forts and villages they fought over were unrecognizable. Verdun itself, though spared capture, lay in ruins. Yet out of that devastation emerged a legend, one that would define French identity for generations. Verdun was hailed not as a victory in the conventional sense, but as a triumph of endurance. France had not broken. She had endured the storm and remained standing. The soldiers who survived spoke of Verdun with reverence and dread. It was, they said, a crucible that burned away everything but duty. "We were not men," one veteran recalled. "We were things made to hold the line." For those who had served there, the word Verdun became shorthand for all the horror and heroism of modern war. It was a name to whisper, not shout. The aftermath extended far beyond strategy. The lessons learned at Verdun reshaped military thought. The importance of artillery coordination, logistics, and morale became central to modern doctrine. Pétain's emphasis on rotation and rest influenced armies worldwide. But the deeper lesson was psychological. Verdun showed that modern industrial warfare could consume nations without producing decision. It revealed a paradox at the heart of the 20th century, that courage and sacrifice, however noble, could exist within a machinery of destruction so vast that human meaning seemed almost irrelevant. As the soldiers withdrew from the front, they passed through the ruins of the forts and villages where so many had died. In some places, the ground still smoked. In others, bodies lay frozen where they had fallen. Priests blessed the dead as engineers cleared paths through unexploded shells. The army buried its losses beneath wooden crosses, hastily carved from shell crates. Many graves were marked simply inconnu, unknown. These were the first of thousands that would later fill the cemeteries of Verdun, silent witnesses to endurance beyond comprehension. When the last shells fell silent over the Meuse heights in December 1916, Verdun was no longer a battlefield, so much as a vast wound carved into the earth. The hills were cratered beyond recognition. The forests that once surrounded the forts had vanished, replaced by a tangle of shattered trunks and twisted metal. The soil was poisoned with lead and chemicals, the air heavy with smoke that clung to the ruins for weeks. What had been a fortress city was now a monument of desolation. Yet amid that ruin, a strange pride stirred. The pride of a nation that had endured the unendurable and emerged, if not victorious, at least unbroken. For France, Verdun became more than a military engagement. It was a test of national existence, a crucible in which the very idea of France was reforged. The numbers were staggering. Over 700,000 casualties in 10 months, tens of thousands of men still missing, their bodies absorbed into the soil. And yet, when the battle ended, the tricolor still flew over the ruins. The simple fact that Verdun had not fallen was enough to transform disaster into legend. In the eyes of the French people, Verdun was no longer a place. It was a principle, a declaration of endurance. On ne passe pas, they had sworn. They shall not pass. They had kept their word. The soldiers who survived returned home carrying memories that defied explanation. Many were haunted by the unending roar of the guns, by visions of comrades buried alive or consumed by fire. Some found it impossible to speak of what they had seen. Others could speak of nothing else. In the hospitals and convalescent homes scattered across France, doctors confronted symptoms they barely understood: tremors, nightmares, sudden fits of terror. The term shell shock entered the vocabulary, but no phrase could contain the scope of the trauma. Verdun had not merely wounded bodies, it had shattered minds. For General Philippe Pétain, the hero of Verdun, the battle was both triumph and burden. His methodical defense had saved France, and his concern for the welfare of his troops had earned their devotion. He became a national icon, the embodiment of calm endurance in the face of catastrophe. Yet, even Pétain was uneasy about the cost. In private, he admitted that the victory at Verdun had been a miracle of suffering. The army had held, but at a price that defied calculation. The men who fought there had not conquered. They had endured. That endurance, he would later say, was the purest form of courage. In the months that followed the battle, Verdun remained an open grave. Engineers cleared unexploded shells by the millions, burying them in pits that still yield remnants today. Teams of soldiers and civilians searched the ruins for the dead, collecting bones that could no longer be identified. Entire villages, Fleury, Vaux, Ornes, had ceased to exist. Their names preserved only on memorial signs marking the spots where they once stood. The government declared them villages morts pour la France, villages that had died for France. No one was allowed to rebuild. Instead, they became sacred ground. Visitors who came to see the battlefield in 1917 were struck silent by the scale of devastation. Journalists described Verdun as a moonscape, a terrain stripped of color and life. For many French citizens, pilgrimage to Verdun became a rite of mourning. Families walked among the shell holes searching for traces of their sons. Priests held services among the ruins, their voices echoing against the shattered stones of Douaumont. The silence of the place seemed to demand reverence. Verdun was not simply a site of death, it was a temple to endurance. After the war ended in 1918, Verdun's significance only deepened. While other battles faded into history, Verdun remained the symbol of the entire war for France. The government and veterans associations launched vast projects of commemoration. Cemeteries spread across the hills, their white crosses stretching in perfect rows toward the horizon. In 1920, construction began on the Douaumont ossuary, a massive stone monument to the unknown dead. Inside, behind glass windows, lie the bones of over 130,000 unidentified soldiers, French and German alike, collected from the surrounding fields. Above them rises a tower that dominates the landscape, its lantern casting light over the graves below. The inscription at its entrance reads simply, Ici reposent des enfants de France. Here rest the children of France. The ossuary became the heart of Verdun's memory, a place where mourning transcended victory or defeat. Each year on Armistice Day, veterans gathered there to stand in silence, heads bowed, as bugles sounded the last post. For the French nation, Verdun became both wound and healing, a reminder of what had been lost and what had been preserved. Politicians, writers, and teachers invoked it as the embodiment of sacrifice and unity. In classrooms, children learned that Verdun was where France had saved herself through courage. To the survivors, such rhetoric often felt hollow, but they understood its necessity. Verdun had to mean something. Otherwise, the suffering would be unbearable. The Germans too remembered Verdun, though in different tones. For them, it was a symbol of futility, a lesson in the limits of power. German soldiers who had fought there spoke with respect for their French adversaries, acknowledging their courage even as they mourned their own losses. In later years, Verdun would become a point of reconciliation between the two nations. Veterans met there in remembrance, united by shared agony rather than divided by hatred. The battlefield, once a place of slaughter, slowly became a bridge. Culturally, Verdun cast a long shadow. Writers such as Henri Barbusse and Maurice Genevoix transformed the soldier's experience into literature that stripped away illusions about glory. Their words described the mud, the fear, and the comradeship that bound men together amid chaos. Ceux de 14, Genevoix wrote of his generation, the men of 14, knew what it means to give everything. Their works became part of France's collective memory, shaping how the nation understood not just Verdun, but the entire Great War. In art, too, the landscape of Verdun appeared again and again. Shattered trees, endless mud, cruciform silhouettes of soldiers against burning skies. It was not merely history. It was a vision of human endurance at its limit. For the soldiers who returned, that endurance left deep marks. Many found it impossible to resume ordinary life. They had lived too long under bombardment, too long amid the dead. Some sought solace in veterans' associations. Others withdrew into silence. Yet in their quiet way, they preserved the memory of Verdun more faithfully than any monument could. Their reunions, their marches on Bastille Day, their careful tending of graves, all were acts of remembrance grounded in love and loss. They kept alive the truth that behind the statistics were human lives, each with a name, a face, a story. As decades passed, Verdun's meaning continued to evolve. After the Second World War, the site became a symbol not of vengeance, but of reconciliation. In 1984, French President François Mitterrand and German Chancellor Helmut Kohl stood hand in hand before the Douaumont ossuary, a gesture that transformed Verdun into a testament of peace. Where once enemies had fought to the death, now leaders of both nations stood together in mourning. The image of that moment, two men, two nations, united in memory, captured the ultimate lesson of Verdun, that suffering shared might one day give birth to understanding. Even today, Verdun remains sacred ground. The forests have grown back, concealing the scars. But beneath the trees, the earth still yields its relics: helmets, fragments of rifles, twisted shell casings, and bones. Farmers call it the Iron Harvest. Tourists walk the preserved trenches, reading the names of regiments carved into the stones. The silence that once followed bombardment has become a lasting peace, though one that humbles rather than comforts. To stand at Verdun is to confront the extremes of human endurance, the capacity to destroy and the will to endure. The legacy of Verdun endures not because it was the largest or most decisive battle of the Great War, but because it revealed the essence of that war. It showed how modern nations, armed with technology and driven by pride, could inflict suffering on a scale that defied imagination, and how, in the midst of that suffering, individuals could still find courage, compassion, and meaning. Verdun was not victory in the old sense. It was survival transformed into moral strength. Out of its ruins arose a new understanding of what it means to resist, to endure, and to remember. More than a century later, the name Verdun still carries a resonance unlike any other. It speaks of horror and heroism intertwined, of a place where humanity faced its darkest hour and refused to yield. For France, it remains a symbol of identity. For the world, a warning. The fields that once echoed with gunfire now whisper with wind through the grass. Yet every gust seems to carry the same message, the quiet vow of those who fought there: they shall not pass.